Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists April webinar. My name is Heather Houston and I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm the president of the Rocky Mountain chapter and we are really looking forward to hosting the SWS annual meeting here in Colorado this coming May. And today's webinar is going to be a great lead-in to that conference. The general format for today's webinar will be a 45-minute presentation by our speaker, which will be followed by approximately 15 minutes for questions and announcements. We're proud to announce that this webinar has been pre-approved by the SWS Professional Certification Program and is applicable for 0.06 continuing education credits that can be applied to your professional wetland scientist certification application or renewal. As a reminder, participation certificates are available upon request as well. Please contact the SWS staff if you're interested. Certificates are also available for those who want to watch webinar recordings. All webinars are recorded and archived for complimentary viewing by members on our past webinars page. Before we get started, let me take a moment to familiarize you with the GoToWebinar system. On the right side of your screen, there's a control panel that looks like the example on this slide. In the audio pane, you can adjust the webinar audio by using your telephone or computer speakers. At any time during the presentation, you can type your questions into the questions pane. Our presenter will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. If you would like a copy of today's slides, please find a PDF copy in the handouts pane of the control panel. We also ask that you take a moment to complete the evaluation survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. In addition, we encourage you to use the hashtag SWSwebinar on Twitter to tweet about today's webinar. Now, let's test the questions panel and at the same time get some demographics by having everyone type the state or country that you're participating from. So go ahead and type that in the questions panel. Let's see if this is working. I see Florida, Pennsylvania, Colorado, more Florida, Minnesota, Colorado, New York. Great. Okay, and with the logistics out of the way, it's my pleasure to welcome today's presenter, Joanna Lemley. Joanna is a wetland ecologist at it looks like we are not on the right slide. Here we go. Joanna is a wetland ecologist at the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, or CNHP, at Colorado State University, where she oversees the work on wetland assessment and mapping. Under Joanna's leadership, CNHP is working with Colorado Parks and Wildlife to assess the condition and habitat quality of Colorado's wetlands, one river basin at a time. The assessments employ field protocols to assess both general condition and the quality of habitat available to priority wetland-dependent wildlife species. Since 2008, Joanna and colleagues at CNHP have worked closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Wetlands Inventory to create a statewide digital map of wetlands. Their most recent effort is to add functional attributes to wetland mapping in order to summarize and analyze the functions provided by wetlands on a watershed basis. CNHP has also developed an online mapper to view wetlands data, and CNHP is currently working on a more interactive mapping tool to aid with watershed planning. Additionally, Joanna has been heavily involved in the development of both online and printed educational resources for wetlands, including the Field Guide to Colorado's Wetland Plans and the Colorado Wetland Information Center. Joanna has worked in various aspects of plant ecology for over 15 years, with a particular emphasis on wetland ecology. She holds an MS in ecology from Colorado State University, a certificate in wetland science and management from the University of Washington, and a BA in environmental science from Colorado College. And Joanna is going to be leading the Plains to Peaks Wetlands Across Colorado's Elevation Gradient field trip at the 2018 annual meeting. Plains to Peaks will discuss a wide range of Colorado wetlands starting at 4,000 feet and traveling as high as 10,000 feet. With an emphasis on wetland plant identification, this field trip will focus on the major hydrologic processes that shape Colorado wetlands and common plant species within those wetlands. To learn more about the annual meeting field trips, visit the annual meeting website. Let's welcome Joanna, and I will turn things over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Heather. Let's see if I can, let's see. All right, I think I'm in control now. Thanks. Thank you so much for that introduction. As Heather mentioned, I work for the Colorado Natural Heritage Program. We are a research unit within Colorado State University's Warner College of Natural Resources. We are also a member of the NatureServe network of natural heritage programs, who share a common mission to advance conservation of native species and ecosystems. Our program has over 25 years of experience cataloging, classifying, and assessing the condition of Colorado's biodiversity and natural heritage. In advance of the 2018 SWS annual meeting in Denver, Colorado, today I'd like to take you on a virtual tour of some of Colorado's spectacular and important wetlands. Colorado is known the world over for its rugged mountain scenery and golden aspen in the fall. But Colorado's landscape contains far more than mountain peaks. Our eastern plains contain vast swaths of shortgrass prairie and sand sage steppe, punctuated with ancient buttes and winding canyons. And Colorado's west slope is a maze of mesas and plateaus that showcase millions of years of geologic history. Colorado's borders create a nearly perfect rectangle. Our major geographic features divide the state into three main ecoregions. The Rocky Mountains run north to south through the center of the state. To the east, the plains cover roughly 40% of the state. And to the west are the valleys and plateaus of the Colorado Basin. From the eastern edge of the plains to the high peaks of Colorado, Colorado's elevation range, Colorado's elevation range stretches more than 10,000 feet in total and crosses several major life zones. We have the distinction of being the highest state in the U.S. in terms of elevation, with an average elevation of 6,800 feet, or over 2,000 meters. Colorado's geologic history, or Colorado's geography, is shaped by a complex geologic history, characterized by episodes of uplift and erosion. Sorry, I lost the notes to this slide. Could I, excuse me for a moment. This is one in particular that I wanted some good notes on, if you don't mind. I have a version right here. Okay, sorry about that. Colorado's geography was created by a complex geologic history characterized by alternating phases of uplift and erosion. Several mountain building events have occurred over many eras as the Earth's plates shift and continents move. Each event has pushed ancient rocks to the surface, only to be eroded back down to a near level plain. In addition, a vast inland sea covered most of Colorado for millions of years, leaving behind thick sedimentary layers. So this is a generalized map of Colorado's geography, which I think is pretty enough to display on a wall. The most recent rise of the Rocky Mountains occurred roughly 60 million years ago and exposed granites and metamorphic rocks in our northern mountains, some of which are more than 2 billion years old. Sedimentary deposits from the inland sea cover much of the eastern plains and west slope and can be viewed in upturned hogback ridges at the base of the mountains along the Front Range and in neatly layered buttes, canyons, and mesas. Volcanism erupted in the southern half of the state 30 million years ago, creating the San Juan Mountains, which contain deposits of gold, silver, and other economically important metals. More recently, the mountains experienced heavy glaciation until roughly 10,000 years ago. Equally important for shaping Colorado ecology, the climate is generally considered semi-arid, but varies greatly with elevation. Our mountains receive up to 50 inches of precipitation a year, while the plains receive as little as 11 and the driest valleys even less. Seasonality of precipitation also varies across the state. This slide shows winter precipitation as a share of annual total, with bluer colors indicating a greater share and browner colors indicating a smaller share. The mountains receive heavy winter snowfall, while the plains are essentially dry throughout the winter. In contrast, patterns for summer precipitation are very different. Our northern mountains are relatively dry in the summer, though monsoonal rains bring summer precip to the southern mountains. In the plains, summer thunderstorms provide most of the year's moisture. Within Colorado's landscape, wetlands are a relatively rare feature that occur wherever the topography allows water to seep or pool long enough to influence the soils and vegetation. This map shows National Wetlands Inventory data for Colorado, which were created over the past 3 decades with various levels of precision. For this map, the polygons have not been buffered so that to emphasize how little of the landscape they occupy. NWI data covers just over 500,000 hectares or 1.3 million acres of wetlands, which represent about 2% of the landscape. This is a very small percentage of the landscape compared to northern or coastal regions where wetlands cover 10, 20, or even 40% of the landscape. Among wetland acres, herbaceous wetlands are the most common in Colorado. But though rare, Colorado wetlands are extremely vital. It is estimated that up to 70% of Colorado wildlife species use wetlands at some point in their lives. Wetlands also support a disproportionate share of the state's flora, and they provide valuable ecosystem services such as flood attenuation, water storage, base flow maintenance, carbon storage, and water quality improvements. There is a diversity of wetland types in Colorado, but instead of describing them all, for the rest of my talk, I will focus on 3 major wetland types. Organic soil wetlands, known as peatlands or fens. Wet meadows and other herbaceous wetlands within Colorado's mountain parks. And ephemeral depressions on the plains known as playas. Through the stories of these 3 wetland types, I hope to convey the biological richness of Colorado's wetlands, the complexity of their history and connection to human land use, and the vulnerabilities they face. The first wetland type I would like to highlight is peatlands. Peatlands are wetlands with organic soil, also referred to as peat. Peatlands form wherever the production of organic matter exceeds decomposition due to waterlogging. Peatland soils are permanent or near permanently saturated. The lack of free oxygen in saturated peat soils limits decomposition. As vegetation grows and dies back each year, it is only partially broken down and accumulates as organic matter. The process of accumulation occurs slowly over thousands of years to build thick peat soils. As a general rule, in order to be considered a peatland, a wetland must have a peat layer that is at least 40 centimeters thick, or roughly 16 inches. But peat can be meters thick. The picture on the right is a good example of a peat soil comprised mainly of partially decomposed sedges and roots. It's estimated that the peatlands in Colorado date back to the retreat of the last glaciation, nearly 10,000 years ago. There are 2 types of peatlands globally, bogs and fens. Bogs are ombotrophic or rainwater-fed peatlands, where the actual growing peat body has no contact with groundwater and is only fed by precipitation. These generally occur in cool, wet climates where summers are wet and cool in order to maintain that saturation. Precipitation can maintain that saturation. Bogs generally have low pH, less than 4.5, and low ionic concentrations. They're often sphagnum-dominated and have low species diversity. In contrast, fens are minerotrophic or groundwater-fed peatlands. They occur in far more climates worldwide, and their source water really determines the chemistry of water within the fen. Fens can have wide-ranging pHs from less than 4 to greater than 8, and a wide range of ionic concentrations. Vegetation can be dominated by bryophytes, sedges, shrubs, and even trees. They can have low to high species diversity. And in the Rocky Mountains, all of our peatlands are fens. Globally, the vast majority of peatlands occur in cold northern climates, such as the boreal zone and far northern temperate areas, Siberia, northern Europe, Canada, and Alaska. But peatlands can and do form in cold mountainous areas at lower latitudes. In contrast to peatlands in boreal regions, where the topography is generally unconstrained and summers are cool and wet, the Rocky Mountain landscape is highly heterogeneous, with pronounced changes in elevation, precipitation, and bedrock across short distances. Rocky Mountain climate is also dominated by heavy winter snowfall and spring snowmelt, but our summers are warm and dry. As mentioned before, all Rocky Mountain peatlands are fens, connected to regional groundwater and potentially influenced by watershed characteristics. So where do they occur in Colorado? In order to understand where, we must understand why. The permanent saturation of fens is maintained by groundwater discharge, either local, intermediate, or regional flow paths. There must be a substantial source of continuous groundwater discharge to maintain saturation in the peat body. The most reliable and abundant source of groundwater discharge is snowmelt that has infiltrated into shallow subsurface layers and is expressed at the base of slopes, as illustrated by the local and intermediate flow lines. However, there are places in Colorado where groundwater discharge occurs far from the source of infiltration. Mean annual precipitation and elevation are also important drivers. Over the past 10 years, CNHP has mapped fens in several national forests and for the Colorado Department of Transportation. In addition, we've compiled data from other researchers to create this map of fens in Colorado. However, you may notice that this map is not quite complete. There are notable holes in the northern mountains where no specific fen mapping has been conducted, but it provides a reasonably good picture of fen distribution in Colorado. This data set contains 17,500 polygons, covering 34,000 hectares or 84,000 acres of fen wetlands. As mapped, these acres represent about 6% of all mapped wetlands and only a tiny fraction of the landscape. And since we know there are holes, we might assume that perhaps fens represent up to 8% of wetland acres, but likely no more. In Colorado, fens predominantly occur in the subalpine between 8,000 and 11,000 feet in elevation. At these elevations, most precipitation is snowfall, which melts slowly and infiltrates into the groundwater, providing a stable water source for fens. At lower elevations, most precipitation falls as rain, which quickly runs off into streams. The vegetation of Colorado's fens is quite diverse. There is a suite of common vascular plant species that occur in many of our fens, including Carex aquatilis, or water sedge, Carex utriculata, or beak sedge, Elaeocorus quinqueflora, or few-flowered spike rush, one of my favorites, Spidicularis groenlandica, elephant head, Caltha leptocephala, or marsh marigold, Salix planifolia, plainleaf willow, and Salix wolfii, or wolf's willow. And interestingly, Pinus contorta, lodgepole pine, can occur on hummocks in fens. But fens, there's also a variety of rare vascular plant species that occur in Colorado fens, including many that are common in the far northern latitudes but occur as disjunct populations this far south. Many sedges and willows, and also sundews. And fens also contain a rich non-vascular flora of mosses and liverworts, including several rare sphagnum species. A major emphasis in global peatland research has been on environmental gradients that affect vegetation patterns, in particular the water chemistry gradients of pH, conductivity, and calcium concentrations, and their relationship to species richness and composition. This has been termed the Porter-Rich vegetation gradient and is a useful way to categorize Colorado's fens. Bogs are at one extreme of this gradient, and fens are categorized into poor, intermediate rich, and extreme rich fens. Poor fens have lower pH and conductivity, are sphagnum dominated, but do receive some groundwater influence. Intermediate and rich fens are typically sedge and willow dominated, have neutral pH and conductivity, and are well connected to groundwater. Extreme rich fens have higher pH and conductivity, high calcium concentrations, and contain species that thrive in calcium-rich environments. Research shows that differences along the Porter-Rich gradient are largely determined by water source, precipitation versus groundwater in the separation of bogs and fens, and the influence of surrounding bedrock. The majority of Colorado fens are intermediate rich fens with neutral pHs and moderate conductivity. We also have a handful of extreme rich fens in one particular watershed underlain with glacial till derived from calcareous bedrock. And we have an additional type of fens, iron fens, which are found in highly mineralized volcanic watersheds of the San Juan Mountains. These fens have highly acidic waters, but also very high conductivity and iron concentrations. These fens represent an interesting type outside the traditional poor to rich gradient. For the next few slides, I want to show you some images of Colorado's fens along this poor to rich gradient. Intermediate fens, as I said, are most common and are found throughout Colorado's mountains. Here is a lovely intermediate rich fen in the mountains outside of Boulder, Colorado, with open pools and a variety of shrubs, sedges, and there's our bit of trees within the fen. Of note, this site contained cotton grass, Eriophorum angustifolium, as well as Carex microgloccum. Here is another fen, intermediate fen, that shows distinct strings and flarks or ridges of vegetation. This high elevation site contained species such as Carex nigricans, Carex saxatilis, as well as abundant few-flowered spike rush, the Eleochris. And here's another interesting fen at a relatively low elevation, less than 9,000 feet. This site contains a floating mat of Carex diandra and Carex lasiocarpa, both considered rare, state rare species. Our extreme rich fens are very noteworthy and occur exclusively in a high mountain valley known as South Park. The glaciated mountains around South Park contain an unusual outcrop of sedimentary rock which contributes calcium ions to the groundwater. Several extreme rich fens are found in this valley, the most famous of which is called High Park Fen. They're found where groundwater emerges through deep glacial till. These fens contain populations of very rare plant species, including Primula egalicensis, state rare species Carex, Salix myrtifolia, as well as Salix canadensis. As part of the annual SWS annual meeting, I know that there is a field trip to visit a significant fen restoration project in the South Park area, and I hope some of you have signed up. Should be very interesting. Finally, I'd like to show some of the acidic iron fens that are found in certain highly mineralized watersheds in the San Juan Mountains. Acidic iron fens are found, have been noted and found in Colorado, California, South Dakota, and the Andes of Peru. Dr. David Kuber from Colorado State University has done a tremendous amount of research in these fens. He is one of our plenary speakers for the meeting, and I think should probably mention these as well. Within iron fens have highly acidic waters that's geochemically produced through the weathering of pyrite or iron sulfide, which creates hydrogen sulfide and creates acidity as low as even 3 or 4, pHs of 3 or 4. They also contain highly mineralized iron pans and are often sphagnum dominated and contain rare species, rare and disjunct species. Just a few other images of iron fens from the San Juans. I know at the SWS meeting there'll be a symposium on peatlands, and I would guess that there'll be some presentations involving work on these iron fens, many of which have been impacted by historic mining in the San Juans, and there's several large restoration projects underway. To conclude this section on fens, I wanted to highlight a few of the reasons that fens are significant. By absorbing and slowly releasing groundwater discharge, fens help maintain base flow in many headwater streams. They store carbon in thick organic soils, and they provide habitat for many rare plant species. They are also among our most picturesque wetlands in Colorado. The second wetland story I would like to share today is about wet meadows and other herbaceous wetlands that occur in the broad open valleys between Colorado's mountain ranges, which are locally referred to as parks. In Colorado's parks and valleys straddle the spine of the Rocky Mountains, running north to south, and many have been formed along geologic fault lines. High reaches of several significant rivers flow through the parks, including North and South Platte, Colorado, Arkansas, and Rio Grande rivers. These valleys contain a high density of wetland acres, and while they are not densely populated, wetlands here have a long history of human manipulation and today are intricately connected to the irrigation network. This map shows major fault areas that have formed the largest parks, including North Park, South Park, and the San Luis Valley. This is another map showing the outline of boundaries of Colorado's mountain parks and major high valleys and the rivers that they support. To this, I've added herbaceous wetlands mapped within the parks and valleys. In total, there are over 160,000 hectares, or nearly 400,000 acres of herbaceous wetlands mapped within the parks and valleys. For the purpose of this slide, I've grouped all herbaceous wetlands into wet meadows, though there is more diversity of types, like the extreme rich fens I just described in South Park. But for the most part, acre for acre, the majority are wet meadows, seasonal wetlands. These herbaceous acres represent nearly a third of all of Colorado's mapped wetlands. And the density of wetlands is far greater in these valleys than anywhere else in the state. Wetlands here make up roughly 11% of the landscape. And as you'll remember, across the entire state, it's less than 2%. But the story of these wetlands is complicated and not well studied. The beginning of the story, as we currently understand it, far predates aerial imagery and wetland mapping. It begins with an oversized rodent, the beaver. Historical accounts tell of abundant beaver in Colorado's mountain parks and valleys. Over 200 years ago, there were an estimated 60 million beavers living in North American rivers and streams, and these busy engineers were found as high as 10,500 feet in Colorado's mountains. We know their dams elevate the groundwater table and support broad willow thickets interspersed with deep ponds in a dynamic and shifting mosaic. It is impossible to quantify the acreage of wetlands sustained by beavers in the mountain parks over 200 years ago, but it is likely substantial. However, the landscape of the parks began to change subtly in the early 1800s as fur traders from the east entered Colorado. The first record of beaver trapping is from 1805. Fur traders were some of the very first Europeans to explore Colorado. In the early 1800s, the demand for beaver pelts was extremely high. Beavers were once called soft gold, and many fur traders were willing to risk the wilds of Colorado's mountains to meet that demand. In only 4 short decades, the beaver population was decimated, and by 1840, the fur trade from Colorado was pronounced dead. Without beavers, one can imagine that the dams were not maintained, groundwater levels dropped, streams downcut, and floodplains dry. This is a story that I've been very interested in for a while, and these assumptions are based on research conducted elsewhere, as the actual evolution of Colorado streams post-beaver trapping has not been thoroughly researched in these parks. But the story did not end there. The next chapter of the story begins a couple decades later when another wave of Europeans came to the mountain parks, this time to stay. Irrigation in the parks began in the late 1800s and even earlier in the San Luis Valley, where the oldest ditch in Colorado, the People's Ditch, still flows today and is pictured in the lower right of the screen. Flood irrigation was a mainstay in the parks, where the primary crop is hay, supporting cattle. Irrigation ditches pull water from the abundant tributary streams of the mountain parks and spread this water over a mix of what was once clearly natural wetland and also onto higher terraces, essentially expanding the floodplains. High elevation flood irrigation is done in such a way in some of the parks that the hayfields themselves actually develop wetland soils and vegetation. What we found in studying mountain parks is that a high percentage of wetland acres, mapped wetland acres, occur on lands that are also irrigated. In the most extreme example in North Park, 76% of mapped wetland acres are also mapped as irrigated lands, here shown in light green. The overlap is smaller in other parks and valleys, but is still as high as 30 to 50%. In this analysis of direct irrigation, actually does not take into account wetlands formed downslope of leaky ditches or on the margins of irrigated fields where excess water collects. Here's an example from North Park to show you what I mean. There's a band of riparian shrubland along the Michigan River on the left, but the large homogeneous meadow mapped as palustrine emergent wetland to the right is an irrigated hayfield. In many of the parks, these fields run right up to the remaining portion of the riparian shrublands along the creeks. They have been seeded over the years with non-native hay grasses, such as meadow foxtail and timothy, but also contain a mix of native sedges and rushes. In the absence of beaver, one could say that it is the irrigation network that now partially sustains many wetland acres in our mountain parks. But the story does not end there either. Colorado is among the fastest growing states in the nation. Rapid population growth along the Front Range, east of the mountains, is placing a large demand on limited water supplies. Water forecasters predict a significant gap between projected water needs and current available resources. Calls for more efficient irrigation practices and outright sales of irrigation water to municipalities has reduced irrigation in some of the parks and valleys. In South Park, for example, a significant share of irrigation water was sold for municipal use in the 1980s. In the map to the right, red polygons indicate areas where irrigation ceased in the 1980s after water rights were sold to downstream municipalities. In the San Luis Valley, the transition has been more to center pivot irrigation, pulling from groundwater wells, which has an additional impact of lowering the groundwater table. Both of these areas have seen loss of wetland acres associated with changing irrigation practices. Areas that were once wet meadows are now dry and dominated by fringe sage. But we have the ability to change the next chapter of this story. The true value of irrigated wetlands is not yet fully understood or quantified. Many in the wildlife community are paying close attention to changing irrigation practices and finding ways to incentivize keeping water on the land. Meadows in the mountain valleys, both natural and irrigation influenced, are highly important to waterfowl, migrating sandhill cranes, and brood-rearing sage grouse, not to mention the hydrologic functions of sustaining base flow, groundwater recharge, and water quality improvements. Finding the right balance of water uses will take creativity and collaboration between the natural resource community and the water community, but that is starting to happen in Colorado. And I hope the next chapter will meet the water needs of a growing population and also sustain abundant wetlands in our mountain parks. The last wetland type I'm going to highlight is playas, which are ephemeral wetlands on our plains. Playas are shallow depressional wetlands in the southern high plains, typically small and round in shape. The playa's hard-pan clay bottom captures runoff after heavy summer rains. The origin of these wetlands is unknown, but possible hypotheses include wind erosion, subsidence, and I'm sorry, that's a typo on this slide, subsidence, not subsistence, animal wallows, and even meteorites. A key characteristic of Colorado's playas is that they can go years without filling if the rains don't come. Playas occur throughout the southern high plains, with the highest concentrations in Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. Many playas occur over the high plains aquifer and are essential for recharging that aquifer. Playas extend into Colorado, but they are not as thoroughly studied here as those in Texas and Nebraska. This is a map showing playas that was created several years ago by the Playa Lakes Joint Venture and Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. Based on these data, Colorado contains 8,000 playas, covering 17,800 hectares or 44,000 acres. This represents only 3% of all wetland acres and, like fens, a tiny fraction of the landscape as a whole. As Great Plains systems, the elevation gradient of playas is the reverse of fens. Playas in our state begin at 3,300 feet elevation at the state border and drop off significantly after 6,000 feet at the base of the mountains. Vegetation within playas is fascinating. They can experience a near full species turnover between wet and dry phases, especially if dry for years. We've had the opportunity to study the vegetation in a handful of playas over multiple time periods, including wet and dry phases. When dry, these sites contain low cover of typical short grass species, including buffalo grass and saltgrass. When wet, a previously unseen population of spike rushes and common three-square emerged from the dry soil. These sites are incredibly important for wildlife. during the wet phase, but they can go for years between filling, particularly in times of drought. I had the chance to fly over the plains of Colorado in late fall a few years back, and it was impressive to see the numerous complexes of small playa wetlands that dot the landscape. In southeast plains of the Arkansas River Basin, we also have larger saline playas, some of which have been converted to reservoirs. This particular one I'm showing, though, has not. I believe these systems deserve more research. They appear to have a groundwater connection as they are wetter for much longer and have much higher salinity levels, which is characteristic of the groundwater in this basin. Many playas on the eastern plains have been farmed through when dry. It's one of the primary stressors that playas face. When they're farmed, farming can contribute to sedimentation that covers the natural playa soils. Other playas have been pitted, meaning deep pits have been dug in the center of the playa for cattle watering. This breaks through the hard pan clay soil within playas and disrupts their natural hydrologic cycles. Like the other wetland types I described, we know that playas are very significant for Colorado. In particular, playas on the plains are important for migratory birds because of their location along the central flyway. During the spring and fall migration, many thousands of birds fly through our state between their winter and summer ranges, and playas provide a welcome watering hole on this journey. In addition, playas play an essential role in recharging underlying aquifers, particularly when they are first wet in the season. The clay within playa soils can shrink and swell when it is dry and wet. In a dry phase, there are deep fissures within the clay. And when first wet, these fissures allow water to infiltrate down through and to the lower aquifer. But as I mentioned before, sedimentation caused by changing land use practices and farming, both through and around playas, can fill the fissures and prevent this type of recharge. In conclusion, I hope you've gained an appreciation for Colorado's wetlands through this talk. If you're interested in learning more, a few years ago we developed the Colorado Wetland Information Center, or CWIC, which is a centralized location on the web for wetland information. This website has been a great resource, and as our work evolves, we are excited to give this website an overhaul this summer, so please look forward to that. But definitely check it out before visiting Colorado for the annual meeting this summer. We've also developed the Colorado Wetland Inventory Mapping Tool to show multiple data sources on wetland mapping, including the fen mapping and playa mapping and National Wetlands Inventory mapping that I described in this talk. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge many people who have contributed to our work over the years, many of my colleagues at CNHP and others at Colorado State University, our colleagues in the National Wetlands Inventory, and funding from sources such as EPA, Colorado Parks and Wildlife Wetlands Program, our Department of Transportation, U.S. Forest Service, and many local partners on the ground that have helped us understand wetlands across this beautiful state. And with that, I went much quicker than I did in my practice, so I've reached the end and could start taking questions.
Thanks, Joanna. That was great. So I don't have any new questions written up, but I do have a few questions of myself. If you have a question, go ahead and type it into the question pane where you typed in where you're calling in or listening from. And also, if you forgot to ask a question or you have to leave before the Q&A is over, you can email Joanna at the email address that's listed on the slide. So, Joanna, I would like to know, first of all, thank you for your presentation. I think it's great, and it's making me even more excited about the conference coming up. And I wish I was able to get into your field trip, which I know was very popular and filled up quickly. But can you talk to us a little bit about what you feel the greatest stressors and threats are facing wetlands in Colorado?
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's one of the things that we are paying a lot of attention to, and it really depends on the wetland types. As I mentioned, wet meadows in our parks. I think one of the crucial factors is water management and changing practices in how we use and move water around the state. It's been fascinating to learn over the years how much of an impact that has in both the formation and distribution of wetlands around our state. And as water practices change, we have to think very seriously about the impact that has on our natural resources. There's also impacts of development, certainly along the Front Range and along the I-70 corridor, as development moves out into more and more natural spaces. We're also very interested in climate change scenarios and what that means for wetlands in Colorado. We do know that there's several different scenarios for climate change in Colorado. They nearly all forecast warmer weather, but whether that will be accompanied with increased drought and overall less precipitation, or possibly accentuated events of high precipitation and large storms, that's what's less clear in the forecast. But drought on the plains will significantly impact playas. We also are interested in how warmer weather will change the timing of snowmelt and runoff, and also the elevation at which at which the landscape is dominated by snowmelt versus dominated by precipitation and runoff, and that may affect some of our wetlands within that band, particularly some of our lower elevation fens that may see a change between snowmelt and rainwater dominated systems. So those are some of the stressors that we're paying a lot of attention to. Agriculture and certainly grazing are practices that exist around many of our wetlands, but typically are not the grazing can have impacts on wetlands, but it's often not the most severe impact. I think there's a lot of ways that grazing can coexist peacefully with wetlands with good management.
I thought you made some great points during your talk too about the value of agricultural wetlands, and maybe that we should be thinking of those in a different way now in terms of the value of irrigated lands that induce wetlands. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we have a couple of questions from the audience. The first one is, what are the other wetlands in the pie charts representing 70 to 90% of the total wetlands? Mm-hmm.
Well, the one wetland type that I didn't talk about was riparian shrublands, our woody wetlands across the state. We have a number of different kinds of riparian wetlands, from the subalpine out along the plains, along our major rivers. And then we also have marsh wetlands. We have marshes, some marshes in the Intermountain Valleys, and large marshes that occur particularly along the Arkansas River within that basin. So we think about 5 main wetland types in Colorado: riparian shrublands, wet meadows, fens, marshes, and playas, and there's variation among those depending on elevation and where you are in the state. We actually we're developing, as part of our Colorado Wetland Inventory website, we have more detailed descriptions of many of the wetland types across the state, with photographs and descriptions of hydrology, driving hydrology, and common vegetation. So I think we've got about half of our ecological system descriptions up, if you're interested in learning more about those.
Great. The next question is asking about what state laws are there that protect wetlands in Colorado?
This is also a really interesting question. There really currently are very few state protections for wetlands. We rely primarily on Federal Clean Water Act protections of wetlands that's administered through the Army Corps of Engineers and EPA. And of course, that right now is greatly in question as EPA ponders a new direction for defining what is under federal jurisdiction. So we're very interested in working with state agencies, probably not to define a whole new regulatory program in the state of Colorado, but to think more about what responsibility we have as a state. We at the Natural Heritage Program are not a state agency and do not direct any kind of regulatory program, but we are recently engaging with state agencies to think a little bit more about wetlands in our state planning efforts, because aside from there are some good incentive programs within the state of Colorado for habitat restoration, and our state Department of Transportation certainly pays a lot of attention to minimizing their impact to wetlands, but other than that, there's really no actual state protections for wetlands. So we'd like to think a little bit more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, we do have some municipalities that are setting their own regulations, but hopefully that will become more popular.
Yes, that's a very good point. Thank you, Heather. Yeah.
Let's see, the next one is regarding iron wetlands, and they're wondering, is there a specific amount or level of iron that needs to be present for it to be considered an iron wetland?
That is an interesting question. I have not heard a specific iron level. That'd be a question that I could ask some of my colleagues that work more closely or have worked more closely with that wetland type in the last several years. I think, yeah, I don't have a quantitative number on that, but it is the iron. It is the weathering of iron pyrite that creates the acidity. So I think there must be some threshold at which that is a dominant characteristic of the water feeding those fens. Some of the iron fens that I've seen and worked in is very interesting because there can be sources of this acidic iron-laden water right next to, so there could be an iron fen that is essentially adjacent to a fen that's fed by a seep that does not pass through iron pyrite and does not have the acidity. So you can go, you can literally walk 100 meters from more of our typical intermediate rich fen environment and water chemistry and walk right into the iron fen because of a particular seep that is in touch with this acidic iron-laden water. But I don't know the quantitative threshold of what would make that transition happen.
I'm sure there will be some presentations on that during the conference. Let's see. What has caused those lines on the hills in the background of slide number 42? I think that might be supposed to say, are they mining artifacts? Mining, yes.
42. Which slide? Which one is 42 in this?
Acidic iron fens, he said on that slide.
It's probably that one. Yeah, there's a lot of mining within the watersheds that those acidic iron fens have formed. And I do think this site, I'm not sure that this is directly mine related. I think, Rod Chimner, Dr. Rod Chimner, who I know will be at SWS, has done work on this particular site, and I'm forgetting now what has caused that that loss of vegetation on the top. Whether it's directly mine related or whether there was some slumping caused by that road. Sorry, I can't answer that particular question exactly. There are some other sites that have much more obvious mine impacts.
Well, I have kind of an easy question, which is what are some of your favorite wetland areas in Colorado that you've visited?
Well, the San Juan Mountains is pretty spectacular when it comes to wetlands. That's where a lot of very high concentration of fen wetlands, including these iron fens. Where else? Boulder County is also an amazing, represents an amazing gradient in seeing wetlands, because it is sort of a microcosm of the state of Colorado, going from the plains on the eastern edge of Boulder County all the way up into the high peaks, and that's where we'll be focusing our field trip. And then South Park is also very interesting because of both the story of the extreme rich fens and also the changes in irrigation practices that have really impacted and dried some wetlands in that valley. So I think South Park is a particularly special part of Colorado as well.
All right, here's another good question here. What botany books do you recommend for a junior botanist unfamiliar with the state who's being asked to conduct wetland delineations, mostly east of the Rockies and in the Front Range?
That is a great question. We here at CNHP, really led by my colleague Denise Culver, we've developed the Field Guide to Colorado Wetland Plants, which is a wonderful reference for wetland plants. It contains over 650 wetland plants. So that's a kind of a good reference. And then as well, if you're on the eastern plains and in the Front Range, Denise has followed up that bigger pocket guide or bigger field guide with a smaller pocket guide to common wetland plants of Colorado's eastern plains, which would kind of stretch into the Front Range area as well. It kind of covers all the lower elevation areas in Colorado. And the pocket guides are actually free. We have a set of them here at our offices that we hand out. So if you're interested in a pocket guide, you can feel free to get in touch, or I'm sure we'll have some available at the SWS meeting. And then Denise is working on 2 more pocket guides, one for the Southern Rocky Mountains and one for the west slope of Colorado, because the pocket guides have been so handy for folks. So.
And I know the question was specific to books, but this seems a good time to mention your fantastic app.
Yes, and we have an app. It's a free app available on either the Android or iPhone platforms. It's called the Colorado Wetland app, and it contains all of the plant information that we have within the field guides, as well as access to National Wetlands Inventory mapping. And the app, if you're within cell phone reception, actually, if you're within good Wi-Fi connection, it can find where you are in space and pull up NWI wetland mapping around you, and then shows you all of the photos and good identification characteristics for the plants that are in our field guides.
And it can also pull up plants specific to the geographic area that you're located, correct?
Yes. Yeah, we're actually doing an update to the app. We needed to reprogram it in a slightly different platform as technology changes faster than we can keep up with. And I think part of that functionality is unfortunately going away, but we hope to maintain that functionality as we keep tinkering with it. But yeah, the generation of the app that originally came out several years ago, you could, once you found yourself in space, you could hit the plants button and it would filter the plants list by the county that you were in and the elevation gradient that you were in. But you can still, in the new app, you can still choose all those same things within our filter, but we haven't been able to program that kind of automatic filter into this new version of the app.
Well, the app works great. I would encourage everyone to get it. And if you're coming to the conference and going to go on any of the field trips, it's a great thing to have with you. Let's see, the next question is, have beavers been able to reestablish in some of the parks, or have they been permanently extirpated?
That is a very good question. Yeah, there are definitely still beaver within our mountains. Most of them are in the higher elevation streams at this point. You know, there's a the complicated relationship between the people who work, between folks who are making a living on the land and beavers, and there are certainly efforts to expand their populations and reintroduce beavers in a number of different streams, but they're certainly not as prolific as they once were, particularly in the areas that are now converted to irrigated agriculture.
Yeah, we do have a woman in Colorado who works with people who have a beaver that they don't want in a location to trap it, and she'll match it up with other people that do want a beaver on their property. And so they're working to use beaver to reestablish wetlands on those property for certain landowners.
Yep, that's a wonderful, wonderful effort. And there's a lot more thought going into beavers and how to use beavers as restoration, as tools, partners in wetland restoration. So there's a lot of good thought going into that.
And if anyone is interested, there's been some silly, well, I don't want to say silly, there's been some pretty interesting methods in terms of reestablishing beavers in certain areas. I believe it was in the Pacific Northwest where they put them in breakaway cages and parachuted them down into certain areas. Was that in Washington?
I'm not sure.
Are you familiar with that?
I've heard of that, but I don't know exactly where that was happening. Yeah.
I'll have to email you a link about that. It's pretty interesting to see.
Yeah.
I read an article several years ago, and they were discussing the protocols they went through to design the perfect type of cage to put them in where they would be safe, and then it would break apart when they landed and release them. So kind of an interesting project. I think it might have been in the 60s or 70s. It was a while ago.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
And I've got a silly question here. That one, I saw a beaver fly by in a squirrel suit. Okay, that's not a real question. Does anyone else have other questions? We're getting close to the end of the time, but Joanna has a few extra minutes if someone else has another question they would like to ask. All right, well, I think we'll conclude the Q&A part then. I want to just give a couple of other announcements, which is to please mark your calendars for the next webinar. You've got a slide for that. It's going to be held on Thursday, May 17th at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and we hope to see you there for that. Also, we want to say we're always looking for future webinar presenters and topics. So if you're interested in presenting an SWS webinar, or if you have a topic of interest that you'd like to see us cover, please indicate this on the evaluation survey you're going to receive at the conclusion of the webinar, or you can contact SWS headquarters. And remember that these webinars do count towards the SWS professional certification program. So it's great to be involved with that. Also, just another plug for our meeting in Denver we're very excited about. It's going to be held May 29th through June 1st. The registration fees will increase on May 1st, so get registered before then. There's still sponsorship opportunities available that provide international exposure among leaders in wetland science to support, and you can support the annual meeting, and there's more information on that on the annual meeting website, which is on the slide. Also, the Rocky Mountain chapter is going to host a silent auction at the meeting, and all of the proceeds are going to go directly to chapter initiatives. And members and friends of the wetland science community are invited to donate in an item or a service for the silent auction. And you can fill out a donation form on the meeting website before April 30th to be included. And just want to thank you again, Joanna, for taking time out of your busy schedule to present a webinar. And thanks to our audience for attending. Joanna, we're really looking forward to your field trip, and we will continue this discussion in Denver in May. And again, we hope you can all join us for the upcoming webinar in May. So thanks to everyone.
All right, thank you, Heather.